Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, you and I joined to hear a story. EWTN gives us this great privilege to do that. Tonight we welcome Dr. Michael Ward, a former Anglican priest, the author of Planet Narnia. Michael, welcome to The Journey Home.
My pleasure.
I've looked forward to this. I really have.
So have I.
Ever since I read your wonderful book, Planet Narnia, and I told you earlier I was digging around everywhere trying to find my copy so you could sign it, but I think I gave it away didn't give it away, I lent it to somebody to get their
good sign. Yeah.
interest. I've been a C.S. Lewis fan most of my adult life.
Yeah.
And I did not see what was coming in your book.
No.
And so it was a great thrill. So I hope in this second part of the program we'll talk a bit about the book itself, but let's set that aside because we're here to hear your journey.
Yep.
So if I could, let me get out of the way and invite you to take us back. Let's hear how your journey started.
Okay, right. Well, I was born in Sussex in the south of England into a very God-fearing, lively Christian family. My parents were very keen members of the local Anglican church, and I had two older brothers.
I don't want to be cynical, but the fact that they were a God-fearing Anglican family isn't always
not always true, any more than it's always true that a Catholic family is really God-fearing.
Exactly. No, exactly.
But they were very devout,
Praise God.
and it was a lively local church, still is, a very lively local church. And of the evangelical stripe of Anglicanism.
Right.
And it was into that family I was born, and I was baptized as an infant and brought up in that place. My dad still lives there. My mum, alas, died a few years ago. But they taught me the faith. I was taken to church every week, and we had a very good children's ministry at that church. Taught to pray, and loved everything that I was being taught. And I remember when I was about 5, I think I prayed a little prayer, you know, Lord Jesus, come into my heart, that kind of prayer, which I was encouraged to pray. And I prayed it, and I've never looked back.
And a lot of our audience, especially here in the States, may not understand the evangelical branch, the more Catholic branch of the Anglican Church, but in many ways the evangelical branch was really where Newman came out of, right?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, he came from an evangelical background, just like me. Yeah. He also became a Catholic at the age of 44 in Oxford, just like I did. But that's where the similarities end.
All right. But the evangelical would be, though, on the one hand, therefore, not a desire to become more Catholic.
No.
Or even liturgically or ritualistic.
No, I mean, even Anglo-Catholicism was a little bit suspect in the tradition I was brought up in. We were very much told about the importance of, you know, lively faith and sincerity and spontaneity to a certain extent. I mean, we were a liturgical Anglican church. We still use the prayer book for many of the services. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like the free church that you can now actually experience within the Church of England. It was still fairly liturgical, fairly traditional. It was very much actually in the John Stott tradition of English Anglicanism.
I was wondering, J.I. Packer and John Stott and InterVarsity.
Yeah, those were big names and big things growing up. But yeah, I mean, the fact that I was encouraged to pray that little prayer, even though I had already been baptized, tells you something about the kind of theology that I was raised in. And
when I think about evangelicals in America, which would be trans-denominational, that I would say that the authors and the literature that fed American evangelicalism would have come out of that branch of Anglicanism. J.I. Packer and John Stott and InterVarsity and that whole group have a big influence in America. C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
You know, very big influence on America.
Yeah, and C.S. Lewis began to be a big influence on me from an early age. My parents used to read the Chronicles of Narnia to me and my brothers as we were growing up. I have strong memories of us piling into our parents' bed on a Sunday morning and my mum reading us the latest chapter of the latest Chronicle before we all had breakfast and went off to church. I
never thought about this. Your parents then would have related to the Narnia tales in a different way, because they might have remembered the background of what Lewis is talking about in part of the bombing of London.
That's true, yes. My parents were both evacuees during the Second World War. Well, actually, yes, that's true. My mum was bombed out. Her house was destroyed around her ears, and she was then evacuated to the country, just like the children in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. My dad was evacuated 5 times around England.
All right.
So I'm lucky to be here. The Luftwaffe were out to stop me from being born.
But you were early on then introduced to the good old Lewis.
I was, and I loved him. And my parents told me just a little enough to pique my interest about the sort of second meaning in the stories, about Aslan being a bit like Jesus. And that intrigued me, because most books that I was reading at that stage didn't have second levels of meaning. And the fact that this was a Christian level of meaning made it all the more enticing.
Right. We'll get to it later, because I'm curious as to whether when Lewis, weren't they read on the radio? Weren't they read on the radio? I wasn't sure.
The Mere Christianity talks originated on the radio.
They were, but I wasn't sure if he ever did the Narnia tales on the radio.
No, I mean, they have been adapted by the BBC now, but yeah.
But again, wondering at the time when they were written, where the audience would have gotten the other levels of it when you look at what was going on in England at the time. But so there you are. And maybe the key thing is that as a young man, as an Anglican, you had a faith of your own, right?
Yeah, I loved my faith. I prayed, I read the Bible. I read the whole Bible when I was about 10 or 12. I remember my Good News edition of the Bible with the little pictures. Yeah. I ploughed all the way through that and liked it a lot, learnt a lot. I'm not sure I always understood the minor prophets and things like that, but I made it all the way from Genesis to Revelation.
A good, proud Anglican, history and all?
Well, my father sometimes used to say that we were Anglican more by convenience than conviction, that this local church was just so lively and a good thing to be part of that was the obvious choice to belong to. I think he might have been a Baptist or a Methodist in another town.
Gotcha.
There was a little bit of anti-Catholicism growing up. We were taught to be a little bit suspicious of Catholics, and indeed Anglo-Catholics, because of the supposed empty ritualism of their traditions. And I don't think that I didn't knowingly meet a single Catholic before I went away to university. So it was a very Protestant world in which I lived. I had lots of Baptist and Methodist and Brethren friends, but I never knew a Catholic, and was pretty suspicious.
I may be wrong, but being brought up in the Sussex area, you were in the neighborhood of Belloc's old backyard, right?
That's right, yes.
So, or Arundel, just south of you there.
That's right.
So there was good Catholic historical spots around you.
Well, and my parish church, it was an ancient parish church. It goes back to, I think the oldest part is 12th century.
Wow.
So I would look at this building and I would see little niches, little aumbries, I think they're called, where the sacred vessels would be held for the Mass, except they were never used anymore because it was such a low celebration of the Lord's Supper. Yeah. There was a rood screen and a blocked up passage to the old rood loft. And I wondered, what is a rood screen? Why did they have these things? They'd all been, obliterated. Yeah. But there were these traces in the building which alerted me to the fact that there was this Catholic past which we were no longer connected to for some reason.
Yeah. In America, one of the most pervasive ideas amongst especially our separated brethren is that when push comes to shove, what's necessary is Jesus, not what church you belong to. As long as you got Jesus, is maybe the most pervasive theology running coast to coast in America. You said your parents probably would have been Baptist Methodists if they had been in another town. Was there a little bit of the same thing? It didn't really matter.
No, I don't think so. I mean, they were pretty solidly Anglican. For all that they said, it was just convenience. Right. And so it wasn't just Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. It was a properly Trinitarian theology that I was raised. I got a very good catechesis actually in this youth ministry. Mm-hmm. It went from climbers through pathfinders, through explorers, through wayfarers. In fact, my dad used to run the wayfarers group. Yeah. And there was a local RE teacher who gave us actually very good, solid teaching in those sessions. And it wasn't even a particularly sola scriptura kind of setting either. I mean, obviously the Bible was held in great reverence, but we knew enough about Anglican history to know that there was also this thing called tradition, and that there was a certain proper place for reason and personal experience. So, the three-legged stool of Anglicanism was something I was introduced to fairly early. And of course, once I got into reading C.S. Lewis for myself and began reading things like Mere Christianity, I was introduced to an even larger kind of understanding of the tradition.
Our guest is Dr. Michael Ward, the author of Planet Narnia, which we'll talk about later. Lewis in Mere Christianity does, in the end, talk about it's been a while since I read the book, but a big house with many doors and a hallway that you go through, right? So that kind of doesn't push only to the idea of all you need is Jesus, doesn't matter what church you're in, but it kind of pushes that envelope a bit, that really what's important maybe is traditional Christianity, but where you're getting it is not as important. So there's a little bit in there, but so there you were, committed to Christ, committed to the traditional church. Was the idea of priesthood for you an early thought?
Well, my grandmother used to ask me and my brothers, whenever we visited my grandparents, she would ask, are any of you ever going to become a clergyman? My brothers would always say no, but I would sometimes say, possibly, Grandma, maybe. I think she wanted to put it into our minds, that idea, and it did actually lodge in my mind. And we'll perhaps come back to that later on. But yeah, C.S. Lewis, I think he was already sort of expanding my horizons into not that I would have called it this at the time, into a Catholic direction, because of his great respect for creedal Orthodox historic Christianity. And, he would sometimes refer to St. Augustine or Justin Martyr or whoever it may be, figures that we would normally not hear about from the pulpit at my church. And, the more I read into Lewis, the more I realized that he, though an Anglican, nonetheless had quite a lot of what I would have called Catholic habits, He went to confession, he believed in purgatory, he had a high view of the priesthood, he believed in the real presence. And none of those things was on my radar from my upbringing, and I wasn't really embracing them either myself, but I knew that Lewis was embracing them, and therefore I thought, they can't be that bad.
Which were expressions of Lewis's own trajectory, right, in his growing from atheist area, right?
Well, he also had been raised in quite an evangelical Anglican home in Ireland, and then went through a phase of unbelief, and then in part due to friendship with Tolkien and other Catholics, he ended up at quite a high Anglican actually, though he always used to say he was not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. But that was just a strategy to avoid being pigeonholed.
I mean, because I have sitting in my office down the hall a collection of his Latin letters to
a Catholic priest.
To a Catholic priest. So he was in dialogue all along.
Yeah. And he was putting me into if not an active interest in things Catholic, he was at least showing me that there was a large Christian community outside evangelical Anglicanism. And it was through Lewis that I began reading people like Chesterton and Tolkien, for that matter. And I knew that Chesterton and Tolkien were Catholics, yet they seemed to be quite good chaps. So my anti-Catholic training, that's to overstate it, but my anti-Catholic suspicions that I've been raised with were already beginning to evaporate from a fairly early age, thanks to Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton.
I think it was Chesterton that talked about, in his book Conversion in the Catholic Church, talks about the 3 stages of conversion, and the first is that if you give the Catholic Church just a little open door, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
But I think the second stage is backing way off, but at least the first stage is a little bit. So were you saying then, at that stage in your life, opening to Chesterton, open to Tolkien, maybe other Catholic writers, was opening the door a little bit, or at least you're not quite as negative about the church, but you're not moving in that direction? I'm
not consciously moving in that direction, but I'm taking down some of the walls of suspicion. Yeah.
Okay.
Shall I move ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I go off to Oxford to do my degree in English. I choose Oxford, I think, largely because Lewis and Tolkien had been there. And for the first time, as part of my degree in English, I study C.S. Lewis more seriously, more formally. And that will be of interest later on in my story. But I'm still not at all engaging with Catholic friends. I'm still not, although I'm beginning to meet them occasionally. I meet, for instance, Walter Hooper, who had been Lewis's secretary in the last few months of Lewis's life, and he actually, while I was an undergraduate, Walter himself became a Catholic, and that gave me a little bit of a start, because I still thought you can be there's no need to leave the Church of England. The Church of England is doing fine. And I had no thoughts of being anything other than an Anglican. But I was already beginning to think at that stage about possibly becoming ordained. And I went to a You and the Ministry lunch at my local church in Oxford to just explore. But I thought at that stage I was too young. I wasn't ready for it. So I put that on the back burner. And then I graduated and spent 2.5 years trying and failing to be a writer. That was quite a difficult period. I became quite depressed, I think, and was beginning to struggle a little bit in my faith, because I'd had a pretty easy life. I'd had a very solid, loving background. I'd always had good health. I'd had very adequate education. I'd had a very blessed, charmed life, you might say. And this was the first period in my life when things were going a bit wrong for me. And so I think I became a bit depressed and was beginning to struggle a little bit in my faith, thinking, well, aren't you meant to be blessed if you're an obedient, faithful Christian? Why should I have to put up with, unemployment and some bad health and things like that?
I was thinking that particular theology, university, John Stott, C.S. Lewis, J.I. Packer and that group of folk would have encouraged you to say, okay, Lord, what are you telling me in this?
Yeah, and that's the sort of question I did ask.
Yeah.
And I just had to, knuckle down and realize that, God was not some sort of pet that I could, click my fingers at and get him to do exactly what I wanted. He was God and I was his creature, not the other way around. But this was really the first time I understood that. And so the question of submission, even when you're not getting what you want, that came alive for me for the first time in that period.
Did you get some of that from Lewis?
Yes, I did. Because, Lewis gives us plenty of examples of, struggling with darkness, a grief observed, the problem of pain, and when his wife died, and, he'd been through the First World War. He'd lost his mother when he was a young boy. He knew quite a lot about not getting what you want. Yep. So Lewis was very helpful, but I was not myself getting any help with regard to paid employment. I earned precisely £250 from my pen in 2.5 years, £50 every 6 months, which I like to say was a regular income, but it was not enough to live on. And so eventually I gave up the idea of becoming a writer and moved back to Oxford. I'd been living with my parents for 2.5 years after graduating, but I moved back to Oxford in the hope of getting some career in publishing or something. But that didn't transpire either. I got a folder this thick of rejection letters. But gradually, an alternative, an unexpected career began to develop in C.S. Lewis. My old tutor at Oxford remembered that I'd done this undergraduate thesis on Lewis, and so he got me to give a one-off lecture. And then he asked me to do a short course of tuition. And by little and little, it sort of snowballed into a career of teaching and lecturing and writing about C.S. Lewis, and eventually I ended up living in Lewis's house, the Kilns.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Really?
Yeah, he lived there for half his life. He died there, in fact. And I was the resident warden or curator for 3 years. I slept in Lewis's old bedroom, and I had his study as my study for 3 whole years, which was an interesting experience.
No, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but at that time, was that when your awakening to the planet Narnia ideas were arising yet? Okay.
No. That comes a bit later.
Okay.
But I was back in Oxford. I was going to a lively evangelical Anglican church, enjoying my faith, helping out in the youth group, and cobbling together a career from these various sources of income. But I realise it's not going to be a long-term thing, and what am I going to do with my life? Yeah. So I think at this point that I should look more seriously at ordination again. Yeah. But it's around about that time, actually this is just before I moved back to Oxford, that that the Church of England votes to start ordaining women as priests. Yeah. And that throws me a bit of a curveball, actually. Not so much for the content of the decision, but just for the way the decision was made. Yeah. For the first time in my life, I had to wrestle with the question of authority in the church. Why do I trust the Church of England to make right decisions? Because this is a new decision. This is changing what we've always understood. So why should this General Synod of the Church of England be trusted when all of its forebears have said something different? Yeah. So that actually was quite a big issue for me at the time.
I was going to say that the first 2 Journey Home programs 20 years ago, the first one was Tom Howard, and the second one was Graham Leonard, the former Bishop of London. Yeah. And that was the issue that struck him. Yeah. Here he is, the Bishop of London, and this decision's being made, and if I remember what he said, it wasn't so much the issue, it's the authority.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the making of deciding what's true in the Church of England. Where does it happen?
Yeah. How do you know you're on secure ground? And that really rocks me back on my heels and makes me think, this is 93, I think I probably won't try to pursue ordination. Yeah. So that's what precipitates the move back to Oxford and the cobbling together of the career. But then in 1999, I think, no, I probably should explore ordination again. And although the Church of England, I think, is perhaps moving in a direction which is not ideal, nonetheless there will be an ongoing place for me. I can just find some corner of the Church of England where I can, have a good ministry, and so I explore the option for a third time, and this time all the doors open in front of me, and I go through all of the doors, and I go off to Cambridge, actually, to train for the Anglican ministry at the theological college in Cambridge called Ridley Hall, which is the evangelical college in Cambridge. And that's all good. I spent 5 years at Ridley, actually. I could have done it in 2, but I wanted to get a second degree from Cambridge in theology, and that made it a 3-year course. And then on top of that, I decided it was time for me to do a PhD. And the obvious subject for me to study was C.S. Lewis, because I was already pretty expert in his writings. And I do that degree actually not at Cambridge, but at St Andrews in Scotland. This is my St Andrews tie, by the way. So I'm studying C.S. Lewis and his theological imagination. And halfway into my researches, I have this revelation, as it seems to me, about the Narnia Chronicles. I'm not actually studying Narnia. I'm looking at Lewis's imagination in theology more generally. But one night, I'm reading a long poem that Lewis wrote about the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos. I'm reading the lines about Jupiter and the things that Jupiter was responsible for, symbolically speaking, in medieval thought. One of the things he was responsible for was winter past and guilt forgiven. These are the lines in Lewis's poem. And they hit me between the eyes, and I think, winter past and guilt forgiven, that's like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It's all about the passing of the White Witch's winter and the forgiving of Edmund's guilt. And it's that really triggers in my mind the possibility that there might be an additional level of significance to the Narnia Chronicles beneath the ones that people have previously noticed. So I take my idea to my PhD supervisors, and they encourage me to pursue that. And I spend the next year rereading everything Lewis had ever written, rereading everything that had ever been written about C.S. Lewis in order to check out this theory. And everything I discover just confirms over and over and over again that this is indeed his undergirding imaginative blueprint to the Chronicles of Narnia. It was stunning. I felt amazed at what I was turning up. And then I published the book as Planet Narnia, and I've been lecturing and speaking and teaching about this ever since.
Now, did you publish the book before your ordination? When did the ordination take place?
Oh, yeah. So, thank you. Yeah, the ordination took place in 2004.
Okay.
And I went straight into chaplaincy ministry. I didn't serve a curacy in a parish, unusually. Okay. I started out as chaplain of Peterhouse, which is the oldest of the colleges at Cambridge. That's where I'd been attached while I was an ordinand, and they just happened to want a chaplain at just the right time. So I went and served at Peterhouse for 3 years, and it was actually at the end of my time at Peterhouse that the book came out. Planet Narnia was published in 2008.
The Bishop of Rochester, who was martyred during the Revolution. Was he at Peter's house? Was he?
He was at Cambridge, but,
right.
But no, I don't think he was at Peterhouse. What you mean, John Fisher?
Yes, yeah. I was wondering where he was at Cambridge, whether you had walked in the footsteps of him while you were there.
No, he wasn't at Peterhouse, but Peterhouse was quite a Catholic college, actually, for the English Reformation.
All right.
Yeah.
So we'll take a break now. And so, Michael, we've got you. You're ordained. You've served. You've written your Planet Narnia and published, and which is a theory that no one else was seeing coming. And there it is. And that's why I felt when I read it. But yet it's like, wait a second, it makes sense. Yeah. But let's take a break, because when we come back, how did the Catholic issue of your life then arise in the midst of that? And was it maybe in the writing of Planet Narnia? We'll find out after the break. All right. See you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host. Our guest is Dr. Michael Ward, former Anglican priest, author of Planet Narnia. And there is a website, www.michaelward.net, if you want to find out more about his speaking and writing, and it's a good place to go. All right, Michael, I've interrupted you. You're an Anglican priest, and you've published Planet Narnia. Hopefully I was wondering how it was first received when it hit the stands.
Pretty well, I'm pleased to say, yeah.
Had you started your Catholic journey by the time that was written and published?
Not knowingly, no.
Okay.
As I say, I'd had that sort of deep laid problem about authority put into me in 1992 or 3. While I was training for the Anglican ministry, there were 1 or 2 other little sort of pinpricks in my Anglican armour when I had to do, for instance, an essay on sexual ethics when I was training for the ministry. And for the first time in my life, I read Catholic teaching on sexual ethics. I read some encyclicals. I read Humanae Vitae and things like that. And they made sense to me. I was impressed. These people had thought these issues through, I felt. And it hung together much better than anything I was being offered, I'm afraid to say, in the Church of England. Difficult teachings, to be sure, but they were coherent. So that was another little sort of undermining of some of my Anglican confidence. But I was not even thinking about doing anything other than being an Anglican clergyman for the rest of my life. But a rather good thing happened, actually, when I, just before Planet Narnia was published, my 3-year chaplaincy in Cambridge was just coming to an end, and I needed to apply to stay on, and I applied, but I didn't get the job, which was a real blow to my self-esteem, but a very good blow, I think. I now, in retrospect, think if I had got that job, which would have been a very luxurious job, I probably would still be there to this day. I would be maundering away my life in this with these sort of golden handcuffs on. So I'm very grateful I didn't get that job. Okay. And instead, I spent the whole of 2008 on the road, actually promoting Planet Narnia, both in this country and in the UK. But after that year, I came back to England and I needed a job. And I thought I better move back to Oxford, because with my C.S. Lewis interests, Oxford is the obvious place to live. So I buy a house in Oxford, and rather wonderfully, a job is offered to me, another chaplaincy position actually in Oxford. St. Peter's College, Oxford, are looking for a chaplain. So I moved from Peterhouse, Cambridge, to St. Peter's, Oxford. There's this Petrine thing beginning to develop, though I don't understand the significance of it at the time. And I have 3 years as, well, I start as chaplain of St. Peter's College, Oxford, doing very similar work to what I was doing in Cambridge, but continuing my academic pursuits, lots of teaching and writing and speaking on Lewis. But then an interesting thing begins to develop. I realise that during the university vacations, when I'm not running my own services in the college chapel, that I'm not terribly keen on going to church. There is a local parish church to my house, which is beautiful and ancient, and I go there occasionally. And I don't reconnect with my old evangelical parish, which is on the other side of town. And strangely, I feel a distinct lack of interest about getting involved in a local church. And I suddenly realised one day that I now belong to the Church of Michael Ward. I will go to services when I'm running them, but if I'm not in charge, I'm not so interested. And I've got sufficient self-awareness to realise that this is not a healthy state of affairs. And around about that time, I developed a good friendship with a recent convert to the Catholic Church, an American. He had been an evangelical. He'd been at Wheaton College, and he's the president of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society. So I see him quite a bit. His name is David. And David, with all the zeal of a convert about him, begins sort of pummeling away at some of my Anglican presuppositions and asking me some difficult questions, which is very good for me. And I admire his faith. I know he's a godly man, and there's Walter Hooper too there in the background. Right. He gives me a rosary, and I know he's praying for me, and so some of my Anglican presuppositions are beginning to be cut away. The key moment comes when David, in conversation with me one day, is talking about the Pope, papal authority. And remember, authority had been quite a question for me earlier on with regard to the Church of England. And I think, well, the Pope is a good man, but, you know, what's to say that he can't sometimes go wrong? There have been bad popes, very bad popes. And I say to my friend, you know, if I were to accept in advance all the things that the Pope might teach, this is one of the objections that Lewis used to make about the church, the Catholic Church. You're not having to so much sign up to what a person has said, you're having to sign up to whatever he might say in the future. And I say to my friend David, how does that differ from, you know, any kind of cult that I might be enticed to join? I just have to check my brain at the door, don't I, and have to submit regardless. And my friend, very wisely, I think, rather than just trying to scuttle away from the term cult, takes it head on and says, yes, the Pope is the cult leader, but this is the cult that Jesus himself has established. Because a cult is not a dirty word, it's not in itself a bad thing. Cult just means a form of worship, and the Christian cult has been established by Christ with a particular constitution to it. He has designated St. Peter and St. Peter's successors as his vicars, as his right-hand men, as those who carry the keys. They are the rock on which Christ builds his church. So if it's good enough for Christ, it ought to be good enough for me. And I've always said, you know, being a fairly devout Christian all my life, that I would do whatever Christ told me. But if Christ is teaching me through this duly appointed Prime Minister, as it were, Christ the King, the Pope, the Prime Minister, then in submitting to the Pope, I'm only submitting to Christ. So where's the problem? Now that was a breakthrough for me. I'd never seen it like that in those terms before. And that, if I were to single it down to one particular critical moment, it was that conversation. And I remember exactly where we had it. We were sitting in a restaurant by the River Thames. We were just about to see a play at the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. And that was a really critical moment. And I think it was around about that time, or soon after, that I was walking around Oxford one day, and a voice spoke to me, as it were, from the depths of the earth. You are going to become a Catholic. And it was announced to me as a done deal. This was an established fact. It was going to happen. The only question was when and where and how. But the weather had been settled. And that was actually a very reassuring moment for me. I'm not given to hearing voices. And when I say that the voice spoke from below my feet, I don't mean it spoke from hell. What I mean is it spoke from the rock that I was standing on. This is the secure ground, and that is where Christ is calling you.
You know, that question that you were posing about the Pope, you know, if I commit to the idea of papal authority, I'm committing to everything he says in the future. You know, that could paralyze you to not move forward.
Yeah.
But that could be said for every Christian group that there is.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, even some tiny little conventicle with, you know, only 30 members. You're still going to trust the pastor until the pastor says something you disagree with. And then what do? You either submit and you assume that he knows what he's talking about better than you do, or you assert your authority over his and you go off and start a new church or find a new congregation.
So even if it's just wherever two or more gathered in my name, if that's the way so in the end, you become your own Pope.
Yeah.
You're the one that decides, waiting on the edge of your seat for that person to make the wrong decision, so you can decide, I'm going to make and move on, and there you are.
Yeah. And I had never thought of ecclesial authority in those terms before. I'd never understood that my submission to the Church of England was already, in a sense, provisional, because I didn't really equate the Church of England with the Church of Christ. But, of course, if Christ has established a church, it ought to be visible, it ought to be knowable, it ought to be recognizable and definable. Or else, what does the incarnation mean? Because the incarnation is all about, the sacramentalizing of time and space. But if you can't see a church in time and space that you ought to belong to, then the incarnation didn't really work.
Now, you mentioned Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton and others, but you've not really mentioned Newman at all. Was he on the screen at all in your journey?
No, interestingly. Although I spent so many years in Oxford, and although I was, a literary type person with a strong love of the 19th century, no, Newman had not particularly crossed my path.
And I ask that because in America, we presume every Englishman knows Newman, which is interesting because I know the last time I was over there looking in that big bookstore, whatever it is there in Oxford, that there were a lot of books, negative on Newman and kind of a modern way of looking at it. And I wonder if he's kind of pushed off the scene. So really, it didn't affect you in your journey?
No, I mean, I did read his Apologia around about the time I was having these key conversations with my friend. But I didn't find the Apologia particularly helpful, to be honest. It's a very wordy book.
Right.
But I have this voice saying you're going to become a Catholic, and then I think, oh dear, well I'll have to do something about that, won't I? Interestingly, when I began my job at St. Peter's, I was sort of saying to myself, 3 years would be about the right time to spend in this job. I don't quite know why I said that to myself, but I did. And as the 3rd year was coming towards its close, the college offered to make the position permanent. And I could have stayed there in quite an attractive position in the centre of Oxford, again, for the rest of my life. So it's very similar, actually, to the sort of situation I'd been offered at Peterhouse in Cambridge. Here it was, again, sort of being dangled in front of me, a nice, cushy, permanent position at the heart of Oxford for the rest of your career. And the very day that I received that letter from the college authorities offering to make the job permanent, I remember I was driving home and I stopped at some traffic lights, and there was a bus in front of me at these lights. And on the back of the bus, there was an advert for Turkish Delight. Fry's Turkish Delight, which is a popular English chocolate bar. Now, you know where I'm going with this. Being a C.S. Lewis scholar, Turkish Delight could only mean one thing to me: temptation. Because, of course, it's with Turkish Delight that the witch ensnares Edmund in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So I think, as I look at this advert, this letter I've just received from the college, which I've got in my pocket, is a temptation, and I need to resist it. But it was a really hard temptation to resist. And when I finally wrote my own letter to the college, announcing my resignation, handing in my notice, that was probably the hardest decision I've ever taken, because that was irrevocable. That was a moment of no return. I was, burning my bridges at that point. But eventually I thought, I've got to do this, because I've heard the voice. I've had all these problems, intellectual problems, solved, as it were, by my friends.
Well, you've resigned from this position, and now you're, to use the word free,
yes,
to move forward to the church?
Yes.
Is that really what was happening at that point for you? Or?
Yes. To be honest, I'm in a whirl. Everything I do and say and experience seems to be sort of loaded with significance. It was a very meaningful period of my life. There was... this is a funny story. So I'm at St. Peter's College, Oxford. We're celebrating St. Peter's Day. I invite a guest preacher to come and preach about St. Peter. And the passage I set for the service is Matthew 16. And we get an old guy, a former fellow of the college, to read the lesson from St. Matthew. And he's only got one eye, this old man. And as he comes to that key moment in Matthew 16, who do men say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. the old man who's reading the lesson, he skips over that key verse. So we do not hear Peter's confession. He just jumps to the next verse. And I remember I looked up, all startled, at the one Catholic that I knew was in the congregation. He didn't actually catch my eye, but I was really amazed that the confession of St. Peter was not read on St. Peter's Day in St. Peter's College. And then the preacher gets up in the pulpit and he's preaching away, and we hear some sound coming down the street from outside. The college chapel is right next to the road, and we hear the sound of an advancing group of people singing a hymn. And it gets louder and louder and louder, so loud that the preacher says, I think I'll just stop for a moment while we let them pass. And I later discover that this is the procession for the feast of Corpus Christi. It's the local Catholics who are parading through the town, singing a Eucharistic hymn, and it's drowning out the preacher in St. Peter's College celebrating St. Peter's Day. So these are some of the signals that God had to give me, as it were, to make me think the place where you are is not the place where you should stay.
So when you came into the church then, was it soon after that, or was there any other major barriers to get over before you could make the final jump?
Well, there was another interesting moment when I went with the college chapel choir to Liverpool, where they were singing in the Anglican cathedral for a week. And I went up to spend a few days with the choir. There are two cathedrals in Liverpool, one Anglican, one Catholic. And they are at either end of a street called Hope Street. The Anglican spire is slightly higher than that of the Catholic cathedral, but the Catholic cathedral is built on higher ground. Make of that what you will. But I've never been to Liverpool before, and I'm interested in seeing both cathedrals, particularly the Catholic cathedral, given where I see my future. I check into my hotel, I go up to my room, and I'm a bit worried about my car, which I've parked in the hotel car park, because I'm not sure I've parked in the proper space. I might be blocking someone in. I might be in an illegal space. So I look out the window to my car just to check on it, all the while thinking, I must go down and see the Catholic cathedral. And then I think, I better check on it again. And then I check on it a third time. And the third time I check on the car, I'm not making this up, I suddenly look up from my car, and there, filling sort of 3/4 of the sky, is the Catholic cathedral. And I've been so concerned about checking on my vehicle that I completely missed the side of this building I'd come to see. It was hilarious. So that was another little moment when I thought...
But a symbol of...
A symbol of how I was overlooking the thing which was confronting me, right, all this time. Anyway, by this stage, I have handed in my notice, and I'm working out 3 months' notice over the summer. And during those 3 months, I begin going for catechesis with a local Catholic priest called Father John Sayward, whom you've had on this program.
Father John, yes, of course. Yeah,
and
good.
The idea is that I'll work out my 3 months' notice, and at the end of September, I will be received on the feast of St. Michael and All Angels. Given that I'm called Michael, that seemed to be appropriate. And that is indeed what happened. And Father John Sayward received me at the Church of St. Gregory and St. Augustine, a well-named church for an Englishman, on September the 29th, 2012. Almost exactly 5 years ago.
So you become a Catholic, which also automatically means you're Anglican orders.
That's right, I'm a layman.
Right.
But that's okay. I think to myself, I really need to learn how to be a Catholic layman before I ever begin to think about possibly being ordained as a Catholic. And again, that's what happens. I say to myself, let me give myself 3 years just being a pew filler in these churches in Oxford where I began to go. And let's not even consider the possibility of ordination for at least 3 years. I just need to learn how to be a Catholic. Yeah. And that was a good decision, I think. Because
it's what our Lord as a parable, he talks about the wedding feast, and he says, when you come to a wedding feast, don't take the front row seat.
Yeah.
You take the back.
Yeah.
And there's great wisdom in that for convert clergy, I think, that, being a layman is so important. And then see whether you're called forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like St. Paul, who after the Damascus Road experience goes off to Arabia for, isn't it 3 years in his case too? You need to work out, you need to process what has happened to you. Because it was relatively sudden for me. Even a year or 18 months out, I wouldn't have predicted that it was going to happen. And the one slight regret I have about it is that I didn't really give enough signalling to my nearest and dearest that this was coming. I slightly sprang it upon them, which I now regret. I should have broken them into it a little more gently. But because it was relatively sudden, I mean, in one sense, it took 20 years, this decision to make, but the final end game was quite quick. And because I had not been, steeped in Catholic or Anglo-Catholic culture, there were quite a lot of, just aesthetic changes to become used to. Anyway, after 3 years, I went to Rome for the first time in my life, and to Assisi. And I came back from that visit for the first time thinking, if ever I'm going to be ready to offer myself, I'm now ready, as far as I can tell. I will put myself before my parish priest and see what he says, and Father John Saywood was supportive and very encouraging, and he directed me actually to the ordinariate, the thing for former Anglican priests, and the ordinariate seemed to be the way to go. So I began training with the ordinariate, and I was made a deacon just 3 months ago.
Now, I was under the impression that the ordinariate, as opposed to the pastoral provision, that the ordinariate was for Anglican priests bringing with them a group of folk.
Well, that's often the case, yes, but not always.
Okay,
so
that's it's more open than it was.
Yeah, individuals can come into the ordinariate too.
Okay. Yeah. And whereas the pastoral provision, you're becoming a diocesan priest, not part of the ordinariate.
Yes.
All right. Was a part of your hesitancy dealing with what your Anglican orders meant before, because you had to let those behind? Was that an issue of those 3 years dealing with that at all? Not
particularly, no.
Okay.
I wasn't especially wedded to the idea of myself as an ordained Anglican. In fact, I remember having a dream when I left Cambridge, when I was on this year's tour promoting Planet Narnia. I had a dream of my clerical collar moving away from my neck and floating off into the air. So
you've read Lewis a lot. We have about 2 minutes left, because I want to make sure that one thing I thought about for those, what advice you give for people reading the Seven Tales? Given your theory of Planet Narnia, which the audience should read.
Yes.
And a parent wants to read the Narnias, how can they read? Should they read it differently given your theory?
Well, in one sense, the important thing is just to enjoy the stories. And you can enjoy them at 2 levels. Principally, as a young child, just enjoy the fairy tale, the adventures. If you're looking for the Christian parallels, the biblical imagery, then that gives you an additional level of meaning. The level of meaning that I've uncovered in my book is really not something you need to focus on or look at. The whole point of it is that it escapes your conscious awareness. This is just the imaginative blueprint that Lewis was working to as he shaped those worlds and those stories. But the idea is to get beneath your radar so that you're just held, as it were, in this imagery. You don't need to know about it at all. If you do know about it, all sorts of things about the books become suddenly much better explained, much more interesting, and the books begin to be much more coherent as an imaginative creation. But you don't need to know about it at all. So I'd only encourage people to read Planet Narnia if they just have been perplexed by the Chronicles, if there have been little oddities which they've said to themselves, why is that like that? When you come at them from the planetary perspective, all sorts of things begin to make sense. And that's Lewis's way of suggesting that the world itself, the real world, is full of God's purposes, even though they're not always obvious to us. God is to the real world as C.S. Lewis is to Narnia, and he's working his purposes out.
All right. Michael Ward, thank you very much for joining us on the journey home. And again, for the audience, it's michaelward.net if you want to find out more about his speaking and his writing. Thank you. And once again, audience, I do pray that Michael's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. I'll see you next week.